How's everybody doing? Hope you're all well and somehow adjusting to this new normal situation that we're in. Just praying for you guys, praying that the Lord is blessing you with something special during these days. So we want to talk a little bit, finishing up social psychology. I think this is like part 4. So we've gotten a lot out of social psychology. And this section, as the screen in front of you shows, is attitude, or when our behavior contradicts. When our behavior contradicts. So that's needs some explanation, and it has to do with cognitive dissonance. So that's our word for the day is dissonance, cognitive dissonance. It should be a little bit interesting for us if psychology has any interest to us at all. And I think you'd admit that there are some, there's some points of psychology that can be expanded into greater points of interest for us, or inquiry, as time goes on for you, or at least, you've come to be aware of different facets of the field of psychology and human behavior and things of that nature. And I think you get the fact that it's pretty introductory. Matter of fact, if you look deep into the PDF of Grigg's third edition of his textbook, or the 1,000 pages of the Nova text, you just find a lot of information in there. And part of psychology, as you have seen with the idea of experimentation, research, that side of it generates just a lot of data, and then a lot of data theories and theories become kind of like psychological systems, things of that nature. Well, cognitive dissonance. So I took just a little bit, not directly related to the PowerPoint, but just to get us started, because it is. It's a little bit different of a subject, and it might take a few kind of runs at it before we get a firm grip on it. I think it's worth talking about, at least on the surface level right now, and then I'll give you a way that you might be able to relate it, although terming it a little bit differently in terms of biblical studies, for example. It's really this expression, cognitive dissonance. It's really just a fancy word for mental discomfort. Okay, so we know what physical discomfort is. We can be in pain, have a headache, something like that, or any number of things that affect our body. But what about the mind? And I'm not talking about like mental disorders, something of that nature, but just discomfort in general. Why do we feel off? We could be tired, things of that nature, but what is it about the relationship between how we think or what we believe and then our behavior? The tension between those things, we might say it this way, causes us discomfort. Where do we get this from? So we experience this whenever and to whatever degree our beliefs do not align with our behavior. So the closer, the farther, the greater the discomfort is. I'm trying to get there you go. The greater the gap between your beliefs and your behavior, the greater the gap between those things, means like kind of the greater disparity, the greater difference between what you claim to believe, or really what you actually believe or think you believe, and then your performance, what you actually do. The greater the conflict between those two things would be the greater the discomfort, the greater the dissonance, in psychology, it would say. So in a sense, we might understand this similar to guilt, a feeling of guilt, feeling guilty about something because we had this belief and then we went this way, or at least we thought this would happen, this happened. That could be just as easily disappointment. But guilt as a feeling is the more subjective side of guilt, and you feel it. It's an emotion, it's a pain, It's a consequence of something that happens between our minds and our behavior. There's some conflict there. So in the psychological world, they're using this word dissonance, cognitive dissonance. But in a lot of ways, I thought this could be related to guilt. In order to really understand where I'm going in terms of subjective guilt or a feeling of guilt, you should be aware of probably two classifications of guilt. One would be objective guilt, and the other would be subjective guilt. Objective guilt is when you've done something objectively wrong. If you are, so let's say you're back in Pottersville, you're there in the dorms, and you jump out on 87, and you're heading south towards Queensbury, Lake George, Albany, wherever. You're heading out. You're flying along, and you're really not paying attention or realize that you've gone past 60, 65, 70, and you're going down through one of those downhill slopes. You're looking out at the beautiful mountains. You're not paying attention. You don't realize how fast you're going, and then you see the lights in back of you. Somebody pulls you over, right? So that's an occasion where you've broken the law, whether intentionally, unknowingly. It doesn't really matter because it's objectively wrong. You've broken it. It's very objective. Did I do this? Yes, I did that. They don't want to know why. It is objectively wrong. That's all. And so that's a case of objective guilt. Did I do that? Yes, I did. Am I wrong? Yes, I am. Am I guilty? Yes, I am. Now, how do you remove that? Okay, it's not really a feeling, although, yeah, you could feel really stupid or upset about that. But how do you remove objective guilt? Okay, so in this particular case, you either, depending on what it is, you damage something, so you make restitution, you repair it, you fix it, you replace it, something. And then the guilt goes away because the act is no longer there, right? It's no longer present. That nice officer gives you a ticket, and you go to the local municipality, and he says, okay, or she, says, you'll pay a fine because you did that. That was wrong. You must pay. And when you pay, then the guilt is gone. Okay, so the guilt, you've compensated for that. The guilt is gone. The reason why I'm emphasizing the idea of it being gone is because now we switch to subjective guilt or feeling guilty. And sometimes that's attached to something objective that we've done wrong, and then we feel bad because we did that. But more often it's associated with an inner conflict between what we believe and what we do. When our behavior conflicts with what we believe to be true, what we believe to be right, and in our heart, we know this, and we do it. And you could run all over the place with this thing and say, okay, so we feel a sense of guilt, and we want. So think about what would you do to remove that? For example, if it's a feeling, how do you rid yourself of that, especially if it's not necessarily attached to something that you've done that's objectively wrong, that you can just pay a fine and then it's all better. But with cognitive dissonance or this idea of subjective guilt, when we want this to go away because we don't like the discomfort. I mean, nobody likes this sense of a shadow over you or a cloud over you, this sense of feeling guilty. So what do? There's a couple things that people do, right? So one is, okay, so this is what I believe, this is what I know to be true, this is what I know to be right, but this is what I did. And because there's this gap between, remember, and I'm trying to line my hands up, and the greater the gap, the greater the discomfort. So we either do one of two things. One, we spin what we've done we spin it, in a sense, we rationalize somehow what we've done to justify the behavior, so that it aligns with what we believe. In other words, we're thinking, oh, this behavior doesn't align. Then all of a sudden, if we say, well, wait a minute, let's take another look at this behavior, because whatever the motive was, whatever something, and we reduce the gap. We reduce this degree of dissonance, or eliminate it altogether. Or so we deal with it on the behavioral level. Somehow now, well, that behavior is permissible now, or that behavior doesn't offend my beliefs any longer. I've somehow now included that behavior into the spectrum of what I believe achieves compliance with that belief. Or two, we just change our belief so that it aligns with the behavior. Now listen to me for a moment, right? Because if you have, like you're not anyway, but if you have this dissonance, this gap, that means discomfort. This isn't just theoretical, but it's actual. You actually feel this guilt, and nobody wants to feel guilty. Nobody wants this subjective emotion of distress, something like that upon them, or this just discomfort. Any discomfort you want to go away, but what will you do to make it go away? This is the notion of cognitive dissonance, psychologically. What do people do to make the discomfort go away? They either align their behavior with the belief. In other words, they have to take a different look or attitude, right? You see right in front of you, attitude. Let me just take a different attitude about that. No. It's not as I thought, right? And the minute you do that, now it begins to ease, and the discomfort, okay. And this is a psychological phenomenon, It's not like a game or something, but it's just, this is what happens psychologically. You don't sit down and think, why do I feel this way? More so, you think, I don't want to feel this way. And so in your mind, you start spinning. I've either got to come to terms with that behavior that I did, that it's wrong, or the belief. Maybe it's just legalism, that could be. And the subjective guilt ends up being an exercised conscience. And some people suffer from this. Some people just raised that way, and they suffer from that. So in some of the psychological experiments that we'll look at, participants were forced into situations that created cognitive dissonance, because they were trying to see, can we get those participants to change their behavior, to align with, or can we get them to change their beliefs altogether? Now, there are cults, for example. Wow, this is a favorite technique that cults use, is to use what we might say is kind of a natural phenomenon. That is to say that whenever your beliefs and behavior don't align, there's a mental conflict that causes an emotional response, this discomfort. And so some cults will use it to brainwash. They will induce situations that cause this type of a cognitive dissonance to change belief entirely, to align with some of their warped thinking. So we'll look at this today in terms of attitude. But when you deal with, guilt or subjective guilt, this kind of dissonance or discomfort, you want to be careful to evaluate it always through prayer and always through the discernment of relevant scripture. Okay, so the psychology, fine, as far as it goes, to describe something in scientific terms, perhaps. But when we come to scripture, then we're aware that there is, objective guilt. There are things that God has said is off limits. There are things that God has said it's wrong, from whether it's the thought life, whether it's what we say, what we think, what we do. And so the way to reduce the gap is certainly not to rationalize or change one's belief, but it's to align belief with the Word of God. And this is what Paul talks about, renewing your mind in Romans chapter 12 and verse 2. So you could think of the source of this discomfort maybe in a couple ways, because one, what if it's like Satan oppressing, with some kind of subjective guilt that really is an overactive conscience, and people just keep beating themselves up and beating themselves and beating themselves up. Or to the contrary, there are people that Paul says, sear their conscience by, rationalizing away the guilt, as we discussed earlier in psychological terms. So that what they've done will somehow reconcile better with some new way of thinking. But this is the problem. One's behavior doesn't reconcile with the truth. So we know when you've committed actual sin, you're objectively guilty of it, but that sin's been paid for at the cross, but it can impact your fellowship with God, certainly. And that what you feel then as a result is not just some subjective guilt, but what the Bible calls, grieving the Spirit, which is an actual emotion that becomes produced within us. Well, let's look at this a little bit as we proceed. Let me move myself just a little. I guess I can't do a whole lot there. When our behavior contradicts our attitudes, and this is pretty straightforward. So we're talking about, with attitude, an evaluation of something. How you evaluate a set of circumstances, a person. What is your orientation towards that? Is it positive? Is it negative? And that evaluation then tends to guide our behavior. When the attitudes are ones that we feel strongly about, we are consciously aware of our attitudes. When outside influences on our behavior are not strong. So it's pretty straightforward about attitude. We want to look at a couple of, there's Leon Festinger, and then there's Daryl Bem. And this is basically a couple of approaches to either dissonance theory or perception theory. And I should say these are like, I suppose we could say two sides of the same coin, but not really. I mean, they're more like side by side in two columns, as maybe one in distinction from the other. So attitude is described by Festinger as the result of cognitive dissonance, while Bem would challenge that and just say, no, attitude is really based on one's self-perception. And then we'll look at finish up with the impact of some of this study, attitudes, positive, negative orientations towards things based on role play and certain role play studies. I get to make sure I'm in the right place. There it is. Sorry. Which side of the page I'm looking on. Okay, Festinger and Carl Smith. This is James Carl Smith. I mentioned Leon Festinger. This is a 1954 study. And in this study, the idea was to get a bunch of participants. And so the experimenters in the room, and he brings participants in, he brings them in one by one, and they're assigned to do what amounts to be a boring task, let's say, and I'll describe what that task is in a moment. So it was basically, here's a tabletop, and there are a bunch of these elongated pegs. And so the experimenter is sitting there, and you can look at this, you can YouTube it and see, 2-3 minute thing about what they're doing. But the experimenter is sitting there and he's saying, okay, turn these pegs or do this. And there were a few different types of exercises they were asking him to do, but all of it was just, really quite boring, right? And so after about an hour, the experiment explained the experiment was concerned with the effects of the person's expectations, Would you expect that this would be a positive experience or a negative experience? Did you find it boring? Did you find it entertaining? Something of that nature. And then they were paid either $1 or $20. In other words, the experimenter would say, now listen, there was an assistant that was to be here, and my assistant then was to basically invite the next person in. But when he did, he was supposed to tell them that this was a very enjoyable task, and so and invite them in, And so what I'd like you to do, and I'd be willing to retain your services on this, is I'll pay you $1, basically just to go out and say that you had a good time, and then before leaving, and then others were paid 20. So you had basically two points of comparison here. What in fact did the people who were paid $1 actually conclude versus the people that were paid $20? So both of them are supposed to lie, but then what is the difference that the amount of money makes relative to the lie and their original set of beliefs? So we'll look at this in a minute. So what they're trying to do is to infuse cognitive dissonance into this particular situation and into these subjects, and then try to determine how the students would respond accordingly. So participants who were paid only $1 rated, I should say this, yeah. So they were asked, now tell me what you actually thought. So the participants who were paid only $1 rated the boring task as fairly enjoyable. Okay, now listen, that's what they're saying that they actually thought, even though they were lying to the next person coming in when they said that it was enjoyable, right? So in other words, people paid $1 somehow reduced that gap somehow. That gap, that $1 helped them reduce that gap, whereas the participants who were paid $20 rated the boring tasks just as that, boring. They might have lied. Okay, you gave me $20, so I go out and lie. But if you ask me, it's boring. This isn't a very, but this is the best picture I could get of the actual, thing that happened. But that's what they're doing. They're just, okay, so turn this clockwise, turn this way. And so, a very boring, tedious task. We'll look at a chart in a moment, and I'll try to explain this a little bit better to you as far as the outcomes and it's how it comports best with cognitive dissonance. So Festinger's cognitive dissonance theory proposes that people change their attitudes to reduce the cognitive discomfort created by inconsistencies between their attitudes and their behavior. Okay, this is what we've been saying since we began several minutes ago, that the idea is, here's my attitude, or we were calling it beliefs, but here's my fundamental attitude towards a given task. Here's my behavior, and there's a gap there, so there's discomfort. I'm doing this, but this is what I believe about that task, and I'm trying to convince myself that I like it, but I don't. Something to that effect. So, what does it take to reduce that gap and remove the discomfort? So, let's get myself out of the way here. So, we'll read this. For a second and see if we can't get an idea from this chart. If we start over at the left-hand side in the red box, which says okay. So you have to say, what is the belief or the attitude? What is the belief? Let's call it belief. What is the belief and what is the action? The belief is, I'm not cheap, meaning that I can't be bought, and I don't lie easily. So those are two things. So if I can't be bought and I don't easily lie, then what happens when you are given a little bit of money and you do lie? Ooh, now there's a big gap. There's a big gap because you just offended both of those, uh, that assertion, right? So I'm not cheap. Oh, yes, you are. And I don't lie easily. Oh, yes, you do. So you find yourself in that situation. That's a blue box. You did a boring task and you lied for $1. So what do we say about the bigger the gap, the bigger the discomfort? And so that's a high level of dissonance. So when you create a situation where there's a high level of dissonance, a high level of discomfort, somehow something has to give, um, to align your behavior with your belief. And so in this case, they're paid $1, not so much. So the notion is, well, um, then that boring task must be fun. Then somehow mentally they're trying to convince themselves that it must be fun. There's great pressure. Um, there's great pressure on the individual when that dissonance is high, when the discomfort is high, to find some reason. And that reason is either going to be to change the belief or to change the behavior. So if they went into it with an attitude that this is boring, then they would have to come out of it with an attitude that it's fun. Otherwise, how could I have been bought off so cheaply? How could I have been bought off so cheaply for $1 unless in reality it must have been exactly as I said. Yeah, that's what it is. Yeah, it must be that in fact it wasn't boring after all. It was fun. And you see right there's a change of perception, a change of belief that comes out of that. But if you switch to the bottom, keep it in mind, I'm not cheap and I don't lie easy. But then another person takes a more consistent line, right? Now, where's the consistency here? First, it's inconsistent because yes, you are cheap, and yes, you were you did lie easily. But the consistent line is, I was given $20, so it's true. I'm not cheap and I don't lie easily. And so because of that, now the original affirmation, in the red box, holds. It's consistent. And as long as it's consistent between belief and behavior, there's low dissonance, low discomfort. Now I admit, please, you could be somebody who, just because there's no cognitive dissonance, you could be a nut. You could just be somebody whose beliefs are wrong and behavior is wrong. But because wrong behavior and wrong belief line up, and you think it's perfectly okay, this is one of the issues we have in evangelism, is taking the word of God to people and trying to show them that you might think here's this happy life that you have, but you're only happy in terms of the things of this world. Once you open up their eyes to the truth regarding this belief and behavior that aligns, what are you doing? You're creating this. The more you present the gospel to somebody and that truth comes heavily upon them, you start to create cognitive dissonance. We could call it this, but it's something that's going on psychologically, and the Holy Spirit, can use that to bring intense conviction of sin, upon someone. So I wouldn't say it's just purely psychological, but I was saying you're causing this this dissonance, because now all of a sudden they realize, wait a minute, there's something wrong with my behavior. And the only way I know there's something wrong with it is because I've been convinced by the Bible that there is. So my beliefs have changed, and now I look at my behavior. Wow. So the idea is to somebody who's in a sinful state before God is to take them from a position of low dissonance and comfort to a position of high dissonance, where they need to change their orientation to the truth about themselves. But anyway, at the bottom, consistency follows all the way out. And it basically says, nah, it was boring. It was totally boring. And they can do that without any internal conflict whatsoever. So some other examples of this, if I can flip a few pages here that I don't need. So here's a case, just another case using the example of smoking. And so here's the belief, the action, the change of action, change of belief. So look at the one side, the beliefs. Well, smoking cigarettes is unhealthy. Somebody would believe that. Unpleasant tension state. It's the cognitive dissonance, where there's an awareness that the belief and action are inconsistent. So if your belief is that it's unhealthy, and then the action is that you smoke, there's going to be cognitive dissonance. Every day you're going to be beating yourself up and thinking, well, not you, but I'm just saying that the smoker, if they really believe it's just so unhealthy, but I'm hooked on these things and I smoke them. So every day they're punishing themselves. They want to quit, but they can't, something. But then you look at the other side, change of action. Smoking cigarettes is unhealthy. So you stay with the same belief, but you change the behavior to align with the belief. In other words, since smoking cigarettes is unhealthy, it wouldn't be wise for me to continue smoking. Therefore, I don't smoke cigarettes anymore. And now those things are aligned and the cognitive dissonance reduces, and a person has a relative sense, lack of discomfort, let's say. And what about the bottom, a change of belief? Well, the research, in other words, you want to take the other approach. I continue to smoke cigarettes, right? Well, then what's got to give? What's got to give is your belief. So imagine somebody's really hooked in a life of sin. Somebody just is hooked in some behavioral rut. What will they do to remain in that while at the same time get rid of this discomfort, this guilt, or whatever? They have to basically convince themselves of some kind of false narrative, right? Well, the research on smoking is not conclusive. No, you can't. Never mind all those commercials. Never mind. No, you can't trust any of that stuff. It's all tainted. It's all rigged. It's wrong. That kind of thing. So you get the general principle from this. Now, I could skip through some of this because I've just described it to you. If you want to go back to those last two slides, but I just described it to you. I want to get on to Daryl Bem. And Daryl Bem says, yeah, okay, cognitive dissonance. Okay, is that really the issue about attitude, something like that? Is there something else that maybe would impact attitude? So he proposes that when we are unsure of our attitudes, we infer them by examining our behavior and the context in which it occurs. Self-perception. Okay, so he's contending that we don't change our attitude because of our behavior, but rather we use our behavior to infer attitude. So he's sort of saying, no, there's no cognitive dissonance to reduce. We're just merely engaging in a normal attribution process. Remember that attribution process, to what do we attribute? Is this something internal? Is this something external? He says that's what's going on. So he's saying that in the experiment, that is in Festinger's experiment, people would examine their behavior, lying for $1, and infer that the task, it must have been fairly interesting, or else why would they have lied for only $1? In other words, they look at the behavior. In other words, it didn't have to do with cognitive dissonance at all. What it had to do is they looked at their behavior and said, well, of course, I wouldn't have sold out so cheaply unless it was enjoyable. And in fact, I didn't lie, something like that. So the way you think changes your behavior is one proposal, but Bem is saying, no, it's the way you behave changes the way that you perceive things. I saw this and thought this is interesting. I have no idea if this even illustrates the point. It probably doesn't, but that's one wishful little kitten. Cognitive dissonance versus self-perception. So just so I mentioned, you could line these up categorically. So cognitive dissonance theory is a better explanation for behavior that contradicts well-established attitudes. If such behavior creates mental discomfort, we change our attitudes to reduce it. You're not really conscious that you're doing this. That's why you should be really careful, especially if we get really, really spiritual about this, go into the Bible and pull some of this out and say, there's a reason for this discomfort, and it's either unjustified. You either have an overactive conscience, or your conscience is operating as it should be. The Holy Spirit is convicting you. There is actual objective guilt here. And true, it's paid for at the cross. We have the wonderful promises of our redemption, but at the same time, we're grieving the Spirit and causing some disruption in the fellowship that we should enjoy with God. Self-perception theory explains situations in which our attitudes are not well defined. Why we will infer certain attitudes in others, and what self-perception is. We're basically looking at what we're doing, and maybe we have some examples of that coming up a little bit. I think, or maybe I didn't put any of these examples in. So here's a few, maybe by way of example. You find yourself listening to you got headphones on or your earbuds in, and you're listening to this music. So you infer, I must really like that music because I listen to that music all the time. Or there's a bunch of food in front of you, and you infer that since I ate all that food, I must have been really, really hungry. Or you find yourself sleeping one day all afternoon, and you infer, I must have been really, really tired, and so I slept all afternoon. Are there other reasons why? Perhaps. Could have been other things. But this is the idea of inferring an attitude as the causal agent to why you did the behavior. Okay, so how about we just finish up a little bit here with role playing, and we all know what this is. This is like acting a part, but how does this play into psychological research? So the impact of role playing on one's attitude, or changing perception or attitude based on you being thrust into a particular role or function or something like that. So what is a role but a social position that carries with it expected behaviors from the person in it? Think about some professional roles. Think about some sort of social positions out there, whether it's a teacher, a pastor, a car mechanic, a politician, a scientist. The sky's the limit, how many you could pick. But are there expected behaviors that go along with that position, such that when you assume that role in society, where people are observing, where people are watching you, does that influence then your behavior, how you act, because certain behaviors are expected, with that kind of position. In other words, so you take on that role. Do you adopt the expected behavior that goes with that particular role? So there's Zimbardo, and Zimbardo, trying to see if I had, so he, this is in the 70s. Sorry, I didn't get his first name. I thought I had his first name. So this is Stanford University. It's this experiment, and it's cited quite a bit, where he takes what says emotionally stable volunteers, and he's using them for a particular study on what if in the basement of the university we build this kind of mock prison. And in this mock prison, it's not a real prison, but for all intents and purposes, they made it into one. And we get some of the volunteers will be prisoners, and others will be the guards. And so then they began to take their roles, pretty seriously. So I was, just doing a little bit of research on that, and guards were given, so guards are given uniforms. They're given billy clubs, things of this nature. Prisoners were locked in cells. They were. Let me see if I got a picture here. Yeah, so there's a picture here. So here's a guy, and so they basically take the prisoners, and they put them in these smocks, and which are just very embarrassing, very humiliating, and so what would it be like to step into the role of one of those prisoners? What would it be like, more importantly, the role of the guard? How would the guard respond? And so they found that the guards began to take their roles too seriously. They began to beat a lot of these inmates, if you will, treat them harshly, and this type of thing. So the conclusions that they're trying to draw is then, so if somebody assumes a role, then they'll also assume whatever the socially expected behavior is that coincides with that role. So Zimbardo would think that he has somehow succeeded in proving this because of this experience that happened at Stanford University. I mean, look at what happened. All these guards just became violent towards the prisoner. And so his findings were that when you create a dehumanizing situation, then you will produce inhumane results. Now, you wouldn't remember really, but if we went back to 9/11, then shortly after 9/11 and the war in Iraq, it was a prison there in Abu Ghraib, at Abu Ghraib prison. And the American military was conducting similar types of, it wasn't an experiment, but they were using waterboarding and a whole variety of just what's called now enhanced interrogation techniques, something like that. But some of these pictures actually got out where they were stripping people naked and tying them up and doing all it just almost barbaric things to them. Granted, the conditions outside the prison of people dying and being slaughtered was certainly pretty intense as well. But some of this then, carried over though some, 30 some odd years later, 40 years later, 30 some years later, I guess, that when you have dehumanizing, then you have inhumane treatment, inhumane conditions. I had one of my classes at SUNY had two of the vets, two vets from Desert Storm, husband and wife, and both Marines, and they were in the National Guard at that point, and were trying to recruit other people into the Marines. And so they would come to every class all dressed in their uniform, not their dress uniform. And they'd sit there right in front, right at attention, the best students you could ever imagine, writing every single word down and taking, but on one occasion, I asked them about their experience in Iraq, and they talked about the orientation basically that the military has before they go into combat and go to war. And I said, well, what's that? And he says, we dehumanize people. I'd never heard it put that way before. I mean, it just sent chills right through me. When you're a missionary, when you're a cross-cultural evangelist, the last thing you want to hear is dehumanizing. but here's the context, right? If you're going to point a weapon at someone and kill them in battle and in a war, you have to dehumanize that enemy. I mean, this is the military mindset of those that we send into battle. They're not human beings anymore. Those people that they're shooting, these are animals as far as they're concerned. And so I wouldn't say any of this to offend someone in the military. I'm just saying that this is a military tactic. Can you imagine going into battle? I can't. I personally, I can't. I thank God for those that do. I can't. I used to hunt years ago. That was a wasted effort. It's a wasted effort. The best I'll do is target shoot now, but not pointed at people. But there are people that defend our nation. Hallelujah! Thank you for them, and do so bravely. But to dehumanize means that if you're looking at somebody and having pity on them, or in a split second, you're the one. You're the one who's gone in battle. Yeah, incredible. And they explained a lot of those types of tactics. Now, just to finish up here a little bit, if I can get my... Yeah, so what about some criticism of Zimbardo's study? So it wasn't clear if participants' behavior was motivated by natural acceptances of situational roles or active leaders. Now here's the thing, right? So we mentioned, kind of what the conclusions were and what the findings were. But come to find out that in Zimbardo's study, the guards were being influenced by Zimbardo's active leadership and encouragement in certain areas. So to me, that taints the study altogether. There's Haslam and Riker. This is Alexander Haslam and Stephen Riker. This is they tried, let me just move Doug. They tried to revisit this, and I don't know what year it was, but it was recently. So let's revisit the SPE, the standard Stanford Prison Experiment. Let's do it, and let's just see if Zimbardo's conclusions hold out. So they really replicated it. And what did they find? In this particular case, they made the change that the guards failed to impose their authority and rebelled after 6 days. Wow, that's 180 degrees from what happened with Zimbardo. In other words, the guards is no, we're not going to, whether it's social conditioning or whatever the expectations of the behavior of those guards, to treat these, we're not going to do it. Guards and prisoners formed a communal system that basically collapsed findings through social identity theory. So, meaning here you have the guards conform to a role not based on social expectations, but based on their own accord, and the leaders' direct encouragement to be cruel was probably the main component in Zimbardo's study for the guards being cruel, rather than what they had thought was role play theory. So anyway, there we have it. That's our last slide on this. Not sure, because we only have, I think we have like 1 or 2 more classes and then the final. So I have to sort of, figure out how we're going to go about that. I may just, I'm going to, sure, it's not going to be a final that you're going to be sitting by yourself or have to complete something online. I will give you something that you can either look up the answers and complete that on your own within your. It'll be something doable. Don't worry. It won't be a big high pressure type of final exam. And I may do just one more study that is more kind of biblically oriented at just take apart Romans 12, 1 and 2 a little bit to leave us on a less secular scientific note, what with appreciation for what we've learned, and conclude us with something maybe from the Apostle Paul next time. So I think we'll be okay. Appreciate how you've suffered through my lectures and my videos. Appreciate y'all. Love y'all, and praying to see you soon. Blessings.